Yes, I'm going to tell you the story about Judas Maccabees, not Judas that went and betrayed Jesus Christ. This Judas came before him. And it's basically, I'm going to detail the story of Judas Maccabees and the emergence of himself, and how he secretly assembled an army of 6,000 men, ultimately taking out the evil Nicanor and his army of 20,000 with the help of God, right? So this story is found in the book of Maccabees. So 2 Maccabees, chapter 8. You can read all about it in detail there. But basically how the story goes is, so he gathers together 6,000 faithful men that he knew were faithful men. And they went and prayed for God's mercy over the defiled temple that was profound of ungodly men. And that God would look upon the people that were trodden down of all, to have compassion for their city that was defaced, and hear the blood that cried out to him, all the dead people that were killed, right, that were crying out to him, and to remember the slaughter of the innocent infants and children, and the blasphemies committed against God's name, and that God would unleash his hatred against the wicked. So he gathers 6,000 men, says this prayer with them, and after that they go out to battle. So they use guerrilla tactics. They go out in the night time, all right, and they move into the cities at night, right, into the enemy territory, burning up towns and cities, and they took out a large number of the enemy. Okay, so after they were successful doing that, Philip, who was with the enemy, he saw that Judas Maccabees and his army was prospering more and more. So he writes a letter to Ptolemy, right? He was the governor of Syria and Phoenice at the time. And he requests more help for the king's affairs, right? So they choose Nicanor, all right, to lead an army of more than 20,000 men of all nations under his leadership to go forth and literally take out all the Jews. This was their plan. He also took with him Georgius, right? Georgius was a captain and an experienced war veteran. He was very experienced at war. So they were decked out, you know. They had all the help, they had all the thing, and they were so confident they were going to win. And Nicanor was so confident, right, that they were going to win, that he basically invited the coastal merchants, slave merchants, to come along, and told them he was going to sell them the Jewish prisoners that he haven't even captured yet, by the way, right? He was that confident they were going to win. He hadn't even captured them yet. He's called all the slave merchants over to say, yo, come and buy them. And he's going to sell them to them cheap as chips, right? So basically 90 slaves for 1 talent. Now 1 talent is a measurement for precious metals back then. Usually it was silver, right? 90 slaves for 1 talent. Ultimately to raise 2,000 talents to pay off the king's debt to Rome. Okay? So they had all this planned out to come and take these guys out, right? So in preparation for battle, right, Judas Maccabees goes and encourages his men by reminding them, okay, of the past divine interventions, like the destruction of the Sennacherib's army, all right, declaring that while the enemy trusts in weapons, the Jews trust in the Almighty God. Okay, so Judas divides his army of 6,000 men, right, into 4 groups, each led by either himself or one of his 3 brothers, Simon, Joseph, and Jonathan. They were Judas's brothers. Now, Judas and his brothers were from the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi today resides in Haiti. They're the Haitian people, okay? So after reading from the Holy Book, Judas gives them the watchword, right? The battle cry. And he calls this watchword the theme for their battle going out now to go to battle. He calls it the help of God, okay? Before leading the charge. right? So with the divine assistance of God, Judas Maccabees and his army kill over 9,000 of the enemy troops. Of that over 20 plus thousand army that came against him, they kill over 9,000 of them. Not one of the 6,000 men were taken out. Not one. They kill over 9,000 of the troops that came against them. That was ultimately over 20,000 men, right? They killed 9,000 and put the rest to flight. What I mean by put the rest to flight, all the rest of that 11,000 plus army, basically they defeated the enemy so decisively that the surviving soldiers broke their ranks and ran away in a panicked retreat. They shit themselves, man. They took off and they said no, implying that they had lost the will to fight and had prioritized now escape over combat against only 6,000 men. They still had more than double of the people that they lost, but they took off. They knew they couldn't win, and they started running. So not only that, right? Not only did they defeat those 9,000 men with the help of God, but they also captured all the money, right? All the money, not half of it or a little bit of it. They captured all the money that the slave merchants came and brought with them, right? To come and buy them all out. They captured every single cent, all right, that the merchants came to buy them with, right? So as they were pursuing, this retreating army that was running away, the Sabbath was approaching. So what they did, they called a halt to their pursuit of the fleeing army because the Sabbath was approaching. And they chose to spend that day in prayer and thanksgiving for the beginning of mercy that God was giving them, right? So they spent that day like that. It was the Sabbath, they rested, they spent the day like that while the enemy was running away, right? So the day after the Sabbath, all the spoils of war that they divided among their soldiers, the widows, the orphans, and the victims of persecution. All their people, they divided everything that they had gathered and won from the enemy, that they took from the enemy. They gathered it and they divided it between their people, right? So Nicanor, the evil Nicanor that was leading the charge, when he knew that his men were fleeing now, basically what he did he was forced to flee like a fugitive. He fled like a fugitive in disguise to Antioch, right? Like a runaway slave, all the while now acknowledging, right? And he told this abroad, right, that the Jews had a divine defender, right? He had to tell that abroad, that they can't be messed with because God is protecting them. And he had to make that known to the people. So it says it in 2 Maccabees, if you read, so chapter 8 verse 36 says, "Thus he that took upon him to make good to the Romans their tribute to by means of the captives in Jerusalem, told abroad that the Jews had God to fight for them, and therefore could not be hurt because they followed the laws that God gave them." They couldn't be hurt. So after this, that army of 6,000 that beat that army of 20,000 men went on to beat Timotheus and his army of 20,000 as well, plus another few battles they went on to win, right? With the help of God. And it's a victorious story, how they come together and they won against odds that was impossible, right? But with the help of God, right, all is possible, ain't it? I suggest you go read that book, 2 Maccabees, chapter 8. Read the whole chapter, right? It's a story of victory, and we can apply it to our life as well. And just understand that you follow that narrow path and you ask for that help, you can get that help, and it's divine, and you can win battles that against insurmountable odds as well. No matter what comes against you, the devil's already defeated, right? God's already won, okay? You still have a chance, right? Time to turn is now. All right, guys. Peace. Comment, like the video, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content, and peace.